Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 10 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 10. Question number 367. A DynamoDB table must support queries that use the existing partition key but a different sort key. The application requires the latest committed values, including recent writes. Which design meets the requirement? Option A. Create a GSI and request strongly consistent reads from the index. Option B. Create an LSI when the table is created and query the index with strongly consistent reads. Option C. Create a GSI and query it with eventual consistency. Option D. Create an LSI and query it only with eventual consistency. The correct answer is B. Create an LSI when the table is created and query the index with strongly consistent reads. Here is why. An LSI keeps the base table partition key, supports an alternate sort key, and can be queried with consistent read set to true. Why are the other options not correct? A. GSIs support only eventually consistent reads. C. A GSI cannot return strongly consistent results. D. Eventual consistency does not satisfy the latest data requirement. Exam tip. Use an LSI for an alternate sort key when the same partition key and strongly consistent reads are required. Question number 368. A Lambda function needs sensitive API credentials in environment configuration. The company created a customer-managed KMS key and requires the values to remain protected while administrators enter or view them and while Lambda stores them. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Store each value in an ordinary parameter store string and pass a KMS key ID as a transport encryption setting. Option B. Store each value as an S3 object and download it during every invocation. Option C. Encrypt the Lambda environment variables with the customer-managed KMS key. Enable client-side encryption helpers for values that need protection in transit, and grant the execution role required KMS permissions. Option D. Create a second Lambda function and layer only to retrieve secrets manager values. The correct answer is C. Encrypt the Lambda environment variables with the customer-managed KMS key, enable client-side encryption helpers for values that need protection in transit, and grant the execution role required KMS permissions. Here is why. The customer-managed key protects stored environment configuration, and client-side helpers protect selected values before console or API submission and display. The function needs KMS decrypt authorization at runtime. Why are the other options not correct? A. Parameter store string is plaintext and has no KMS transport setting. B. S3 object encryption addresses storage, not Lambda configuration handling. D. A separate retrieval function and layer are unnecessary and do not directly satisfy the environment variable requirement. Exam tip. Lambda KMS configuration protects environment variables at rest. Client-side helpers add protection for sensitive values in transit. Question number 369. An orders table contains more than 100,000 items and uses order_ID as its only primary key. The application must efficiently retrieve every item whose order_source value is mobile app. Which change provides the best access pattern? Option A. Add a GSI with order_source as its partition key and query the index for mobile app. Option B. Add a GSI with order_source only as its sort key and query without a partition key value. Option C. Add an LSI whose partition key is order_source. Option D. Scan the entire table and apply a post-read filter for mobile app. The correct answer is A. Add a GSI with order_source as its partition key and query the index for mobile app. Here is why. The GSI creates a key-based access path for order_source and avoids scanning more than 100,000 base table items. Why are the other options not correct? B. Query requires an equality value for the index partition key. C. An LSI must share the base table partition key and cannot be added after table creation. D. A filtered scan still reads the full table before filtering. Exam tip. Add a GSI when an existing DynamoDB table needs efficient queries by a new partition key attribute. Question number 370. An EC2 instance has an instance profile role that explicitly denies every S3 action. The application also has a shared credentials file containing a different IAM principals: administrator access key and secret key. The SDK resolves the shared file credentials before the instance profile credentials. What S3 access will the application have? Option A. It can list buckets but cannot read objects. Option B. It cannot perform S3 operations because the deny on the unrelated instance role applies to every principal on the instance. Option C. It can perform the S3 actions allowed to the administrator principal whose credentials the SDK selected. Option D. It can list objects in only one bucket per request. The correct answer is C. It can perform the S3 actions allowed to the administrator principal whose credentials the SDK selected. Here is why. IAM authorization evaluates the principal that signed the request. Because the SDK selected shared file administrator credentials, the explicit deny attached to the different instance profile role is not part of that request context. Why are the other options not correct? A. Administrator credentials are not limited to list buckets. B. A deny on one principal does not automatically deny an unrelated IAM principal. D. S3 listing is not restricted to one bucket per request by this credential scenario. Exam tip. The SDK credential provider chain selects one credential source. IAM evaluates policies for the selected principal. Question number 371. A DynamoDB stream record sales updates. A notification function should run only when the new image shows transaction_status equal to failed and price above a specified threshold. The function then publishes the failed sale details to SNS. Which solution requires the least application code? Option A. Invoke Lambda for every stream record and implement both conditions in the handler. Option B. Create a direct DynamoDB streams event source mapping to SNS. Option C. Add filter criteria to the DynamoDB streams Lambda event source mapping, then publish matching records to SNS from the function. Option D. Create a Cloud Watch alarm that evaluates arbitrary attributes inside stream records. The correct answer is C. Add filter criteria to the DynamoDB streams Lambda event source mapping, then publish matching records to SNS from the function. Here is why. Event filtering prevents non-matching stream records from invoking the function, reducing handler logic and compute, while Lambda publishes only qualifying sales to SNS. Why are the other options not correct? A. Handler-side filtering invokes Lambda for every record. B. DynamoDB streams cannot directly use SNS as an event source mapping target. D. Cloud Watch alarms do not inspect arbitrary business attributes in stream records. Exam tip. Use Lambda event source filters to discard irrelevant DynamoDB stream records before invocation. Question number 372. A completed order must be sent independently and concurrently to 3 Lambda functions, each integrating with a different external service. Every function must receive its own copy even if another subscriber fails. Which integration pattern meets the requirement? Option A. Publish the order to one SQSQ and let all 3 functions compete for messages. Option B. Publish the order to an SNS topic and subscribe all 3 Lambda functions. Option C. Register all 3 functions in one ALB target group. Option D. Move all external integration code into one sequential step functions task. The correct answer is B. Publish the order to an SNS topic and subscribe all 3 Lambda functions. Here is why. SNS fanout delivers an independent copy of each event to every Lambda subscription, so one subscriber's failure does not prevent invocation of the others. Why are the other options not correct? A. Consumers of one SQSQ compete for messages instead of each receiving a copy. C. A LB target selection invokes one target for a request. D. Moving complex independent logic into one workflow creates unnecessary coupling. Exam tip. Use SNS fanout when multiple independent subscribers must each receive the same event. Question number 373. A DynamoDB table currently uses customer_ID as the partition key and order_ID as the sort key. A new Lambda function must efficiently retrieve orders by order_date and then sort or filter by order_ID. The index must be added to the existing table. Which solution is most operationally efficient? Option A. Enable DynamoDB streams and query historical stream records. Option B. Add a GSI with order_date as the partition key and order_ID as the sort key, then query the index. Option C. Add an LSI with order_date as a new partition key. Option D. Scan the base table and combine matching records in Lambda. The correct answer is B. Add a GSI with order_date as the partition key and order_ID as the sort key, then query the index. Here is why. A GSI can be added to an existing table and provides the required alternate partition and sort key for efficient query operations. Why are the other options not correct? A. Streams are change logs, not a current state query index. C. An LSI must retain customer_ID as the partition key and must be defined at table creation. D. A scan reads the entire table and adds Lambda processing. Exam tip. Use a GSI for a new access pattern that changes the partition key of an existing DynamoDB table. Question number 374. A Lambda function can spend up to 10 minutes generating a customer video. After completion, the browser receives a download link that must remain usable for at least 3 hours. Which storage and access method meets the requirement? Option A. Keep the video in the functions/tmp directory and return a function URL. Option B. Store the video in S3 and return an S3 pre-signed URL with an appropriate expiration. Option C. Store the file in EFS and generate an S3-style pre-signed URL for the file. Option D. Store the object inside a CloudFront distribution and generate an S3 pre-signed URL from CloudFront. The correct answer is B. Store the video in S3 and return an S3 pre-signed URL with an appropriate expiration. Here is why. S3 provides durable object storage, and a pre-signed URL grants time-limited download access for at least the required 3-hour period. Why are the other options not correct? A/TMP is ephemeral and tied to one Lambda execution environment. C. EFS does not provide S3 pre-signed object URLs. D. CloudFront stores cached copies but is not the origin object store described, and S3 pre-signed URLs are not generated for CloudFront objects. Exam tip. Store generated files in S3 and issue pre-signed URLs for temporary browser access. Question number 375. An API gateway REST API invokes a production Lambda version. A developer must test an updated function through API gateway without exposing any production user to the test implementation. Which approach has the least operational overhead? Option A. Deploy a canary to the production stage and test through the production URL. Option B. Make the production endpoint private during testing. Option C. Create a separate test stage, use a stage variable to reference the updated Lambda version or alias, and test through the test stage URL. Option D. Duplicate the entire production environment in another CloudFormation stack. The correct answer is C. Create a separate test stage, use a stage variable to reference the updated Lambda version or alias, and test through the test stage URL. Here is why. The separate stage isolates test traffic and configuration from production while reusing the existing API definition with minimal extra resources. Why are the other options not correct? A. A production canary intentionally exposes some production traffic to the update. B. Changing the production endpoint type disrupts users and does not create isolation. D. Duplicating the full stack adds unnecessary resources and maintenance. Exam tip. Use API gateway stages and stage variables to test alternate Lambda versions without affecting production. Question number 376. A Lambda-backed application must minimize user impact when releasing a new function. Version. The developer wants to expose only 10% of invocations initially and immediately. Return all traffic to the prior version if errors increase. Which deployment configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Point an alias directly to the new version for 100% of traffic and move it back only after errors occur. Option B. Configure a weighted Lambda alias with 90% routed to the current version and 10% to the new version. Set the weight back to the current version during rollback. Option C. Invoke a hard-coded version ARN from the application and manually edit application code to roll back. Option D. Configure one alias to route traffic to two other aliases. The correct answer is B. Configure a weighted Lambda alias with 90% routed to the current version and 10% to the new version. Set the weight back to the current version during rollback. Here is why. Weighted aliases provide a stable invocation ARN, limited canary exposure, and an immediate configuration-only rollback to the prior version. Why are the other options not correct? A. Sending all traffic to the update maximizes user impact. C. Hard-coded version ARNs require application changes for each release and rollback. D. Lambda aliases route between function versions, not between other aliases. Exam tip. Use a weighted Lambda alias for low-impact canary releases and rapid rollback. Question number 377. A DynamoDB table stores exam results with student_ID as the partition key, subject_name as the sort key, and top_score as an attribute. The application must quickly find the highest scoring student for each subject. Which index supports this query pattern? Option A. A GSI with subject_name as the partition key and top_score as the sort key. Option B. An LSI with subject_name as the partition key and top_score as the sort key. Option C. A GSI with subject_name as the partition key and student_ID as the sort key. Option D. An LSI with top_score as the partition key and student_ID as the sort key. The correct answer is A. A GSI with subject_name as the partition key and top_score as the sort key. Here is why. The application can query one subject partition, sort scores numerically, and request the highest result to obtain the top student's projected student_ID. Why are the other options not correct? B. An LSI must use the base table's student_ID partition key. C. Sorting by student_ID does not identify the highest score efficiently. D. The proposed LSI changes the partition key and does not support the subject query. Exam tip. For leaderboards, use the grouping attribute as a GSI partition key and the score as the sort key. Question number 378. An SNS topic carries several kinds of customer profile changes. One Lambda subscriber should receive only email address updates, while other subscribers continue receiving their relevant message types. Which solution requires the least development effort? Option A. Add an SNS subscription filter policy to the Lambda subscription for email address updates. Option B. Invoke Lambda for every message and republish rejected messages to SNS. Option C. Add an SQS and configure a queue-level filter policy. Option D. Configure Lambda event source filtering directly on the SNS trigger. The correct answer is A. Add an SNS subscription filter policy to the Lambda subscription for email address updates. Here is why. SNS evaluates the filter before delivery and invokes this Lambda subscriber only for matching message attributes or JSON body properties. Why are the other options not correct? B. Handler filtering invokes Lambda unnecessarily and republishing can create loops or duplicates. C. Filter policies belong to SNS subscriptions, not SQS configuration. D. Lambda event source filtering is not the filtering mechanism for direct SNS invocation. Exam tip. Apply an SNS subscription filter policy when each subscriber needs only a subset of topic messages. Question number 379. A web application runs on replaceable EC2 instances. User sessions must survive an instance failure and scale independently of the web tier. Where should the application store session state? Option A. In DynamoDB. Option B. In SQS messages. Option C. In load balancer sticky session cookies only. Option D. In connection draining state on the load balancer. The correct answer is A. In DynamoDB. Here is why. DynamoDB provides durable, shared, highly scalable session storage independent of any individual EC2 instance. Why are the other options not correct? B. SQS is a message queue rather than a keyed session data store. C. Sticky sessions still tie a user to an instance whose failure can lose local state. D. Connection draining handles instance removal but does not persist sessions. Exam tip. Store session state in a shared durable service so stateless compute instances can fail or scale independently. Question number 380. CloudFormation manages an ECS service that uses code deploy. New task sets must receive a small percentage of production traffic before the deployment shifts all traffic to the new version. How should the template implement this deployment? Option A. Create a separate stack for each release and manually change DNS. Option B. Add the AWS code deploy blue-green transform and an AWS code deploy blue-green hook to the top-level application template. Option C. Use ordinary stack updates without a code deploy blue/green hook. Option D. Put the blue/green transform and hook only inside a nested stack. The correct answer is B. Add the AWS code deploy blue-green transform and an AWS code deploy blue-green hook to the top-level application template. Here is why. The CloudFormation blue/green hook creates the replacement ECS task set and uses code deploy traffic routing settings for canary or linear exposure before full cutover. Why are the other options not correct? A. Separate stacks and DNS changes replace managed code deploy traffic shifting. C. Ordinary updates do not configure ECS blue/green traffic routing. D. Blue/green hooks are not supported in nested stack templates. Exam tip. ECS blue/green deployments through CloudFormation require the transform and code deploy hook in the top-level template. Question number 381. Microservices on EC2 generate too many independent logs to correlate one transaction. Across service boundaries. The developer wants distributed traces that follow requests between the services. Which two actions are required for the legacy X-Ray SDK and daemon model? Choose 2. Option A. Install and run the X-Ray daemon on the EC2 hosts and permit the local UDP traffic used for segment submission. Option B. Configure CloudWatch to convert application logs into X-Ray traces. Option C. Add the X-Ray SDK to the microservices and instrument outgoing and incoming requests. Option D. create a global daemon VPC endpoint that listens on TCP port 2000. E. Use CloudWatch metric streams instead of request tracing. The correct answer is A. Install and run the X-ray daemon on the EC2 hosts and permit the local UDP traffic used for segment submission. C. Add the X-ray SDK to the microservices and instrument outgoing and incoming requests. Here is why. The SDK creates and propagates trace segments and subsegments, while the daemon receives those documents and sends them to the X-ray service. Why are the other options not correct? B. CloudWatch logs are not automatically converted into distributed traces. D. The daemon is an agent on the host, not a global TCP endpoint. E. Metric streams contain metrics rather than per-transaction request traces. Exam tip. Legacy X-ray tracing on EC2 combines SDK instrumentation with a local daemon. AWS recommends OpenTelemetry for new instrumentation. Question number 382. A team needs a repeatable way to package and deploy Lambda functions together with their dependent infrastructure. The solution should minimize custom scripting and run through an existing CI/CD workflow. Which approach has the least operational overhead? Option A. Package functions manually and upload zip files through the console. Option B. Use shell scripts and AWS CLI commands to create and deploy every resource. Option C. Define the application with AWS SAM and use SAM CLI commands in the CI/CD pipeline. Option D. Store Lambda container images in code artifact and deploy them with custom CLI scripts. The correct answer is C. Define the application with AWS SAM and use SAM CLI commands in the CI/CD pipeline. Here is why. SAM models Lambda functions and dependent resources in one template and provides managed build, package, and deployment workflows with little custom scripting. Why are the other options not correct? A. Manual console deployment is not repeatable or automated. B. Custom shell and CLI logic recreates infrastructure as code tooling. D. Lambda images belong in ECR, not code artifact, and custom scripts add overhead. Exam tip. Use SAM templates and SAM CLI in CI/CD for repeatable serverless application deployment. Question number 383. DynamoDB changes are currently processed by a nightly analytics job. Analysts now need processed results shortly after each write occurs. Which architecture pattern enables processing as data arrives? Option A. A scheduled batch pattern. Option B. A client-server polling pattern. Option C. An event-driven pattern. Option D. A synchronous fan-out only pattern. The correct answer is C. An event-driven pattern. Here is why. An event-driven design reacts to each data change and starts processing soon after the event occurs instead of waiting for a scheduled batch. Why are the other options not correct? A. A schedule preserves batch latency. B. Client polling does not naturally process every write as it arrives. D. Fanout describes distribution to multiple consumers but does not by itself define the change-triggered architecture. Exam tip. Use event-driven processing when data changes must trigger near real-time work. Question number 384. Application secrets are stored in Secrets Manager in US, West, 1. A disaster recovery. Deployment in US, East, 1 needs continuously replicated copies encrypted with a key in the destination region. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Configure each primary secret for multi-region replication to US, East, 1 and select AKMS key in US, East, 1 for the replica. Option B. Create independent secrets in US, East, 1 and point them back to US, West, 1 as a source. Option C. Copy the secrets to S3 and use S3 cross-region replication. Option D. Run a replication rule only when secret rotation occurs. The correct answer is A. Configure each primary secret for multi-region replication to US East 1 and select a KMS key in US East 1 for the replica. Here is why. Secrets Manager creates and maintains a regional replica, including secret value and metadata, and encrypts it with the selected destination region KMS key. Why are the other options not correct? B. Replication is initiated from the primary secret, not by manually creating a reverse source relationship. C. S3 replication is not a secrets manager replication mechanism. D. Secret replication is not limited to rotation events. Exam tip. Configure secrets manager replicas from the primary region and choose a KMS key in each destination region. Question number 385. An Aurora-backed application is adding a cache. Whenever an item is created or changed, the cache must immediately contain the new value so subsequent reads do not return an older cached copy. Which caching strategy meets the requirement? Option A. Lazy loading. Option B. Read-through caching. Option C. TTL-only expiration. Option D. Write-through caching. The correct answer is D. Write-through caching. Here is why. Every create or update writes the new value to the cache as part of the write path, so subsequent reads find the latest cached value. Why are the other options not correct? A. TTL permits stale values until expiration. B. Read-through fills the cache during reads and does not automatically update it on every database write. C. Lazy loading can return stale cached values unless invalidation is added. Exam tip. Use write-through caching when the cache must be updated whenever the source data changes. Question number 386. A Java Lambda function behaves unexpectedly during testing. The developer needs request tracing and service map capabilities to diagnose execution flow. Which AWS service should be used? Option A. AWS Cloud Trail. Option B. AWS Trusted Advisor. Option C. AWS X-Ray. Option D. Amazon Cloud Watch metrics only. The correct answer is C. AWS X-Ray. Here is why. X-Ray provides distributed traces, segments, subsegments, and service maps for diagnosing request flow and latency in Lambda applications. Why are the other options not correct? A. Cloud Trail records AWS API activity. B. Trusted Advisor provides account recommendations. D. CloudWatch metrics and logs help observe a function but do not replace distributed tracing. Exam tip. Use X-ray or OpenTelemetry tracing when troubleshooting request paths and downstream calls. Question number 387. Only registered users may call selected API Gateway REST API resources. Authentication. Tokens must expire automatically, and clients must periodically obtain refreshed tokens. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Create an IAM user for every application user and use IAM authorization. Option B. Maintain custom user token records in a database and write a Lambda authorizer. Option C. Use a Cognito identity pool and pass temporary AWS credentials to a Cognito authorizer. Option D. Use a Cognito user pool with an API Gateway Cognito authorizer and submit user pool access or ID tokens. The correct answer is D. Use a Cognito user pool with an API Gateway Cognito authorizer and submit user pool access or ID tokens. Here is why. User pools manage registration and authentication, issue expiring JWTs, and support refresh tokens. API Gateway validates the configured user pool token. Why are the other options not correct? A. Identity pools issue temporary AWS credentials and are not the user pool authorizer source. B. A custom token database and authorizer add security and maintenance work. C. IAM users are inappropriate for application end users. Exam tip. Use Cognito user pools for application sign-in and API JWT authorization. Use identity pools when users need temporary AWS credentials. Question number 388. An API gateway and Lambda application stores data in DynamoDB. The team wants to identify latency, errors, and bottlenecks across the complete request path with the least custom diagnostic code. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A, enable and instrument AWS X-ray, then inspect traces and the service map. Option B, add exception logging to every function and manually correlate logs insights results. Option C, create only an API gateway metric filter for too many requests exception. Option D, inspect only DynamoDB throttling metrics. The correct answer is A, enable and instrument AWS X-ray, then inspect traces and the service map. Here is why. X-ray correlates the API gateway, Lambda, and supported downstream segments, showing latency, faults, and service dependencies across the application path. Why are the other options not correct? B, manual log correlation requires more development effort and can miss dependency timing. C, one throttling filter covers only a narrow API symptom. D, DynamoDB metrics do not reveal bottlenecks in API gateway or Lambda. Exam tip. Use distributed traces and a service map to locate end-to-end bottlenecks in a serverless request path. Question number 389. A SAM application contains a Lambda function that stores email registrations in DynamoDB. The function must be reachable through HTTP with minimal additional infrastructure. Configuration. Which two front doors meet the requirement? Choose two. Option A, a Lambda function URL. Option B, AWS Global Accelerator. Option C, a gateway load balancer. Option D, Amazon API Gateway. E, a network load balancer. The correct answer is A, a Lambda function URL. D, Amazon API Gateway. Here is why. Both services provide managed HTTP endpoints for Lambda and can be declared with minimal SAM configuration. API Gateway supports a full REST API, while a function URL is the simplest direct endpoint. Why are the other options not correct? B, Global Accelerator is not a direct Lambda HTTP integration. C, Gateway Load Balancer targets network virtual appliances. E, Network Load Balancer does not directly target Lambda functions. Exam tip. Use a function URL for a simple direct Lambda endpoint or API gateway for full-featured API management. Question number 390. An EC2 application publishes a high-resolution custom CloudWatch metric every second. The operations team needs an SNS notification within 30 seconds of a threshold breach. Which CloudWatch configuration meets the requirement? Option A, a standard resolution metric and 5-minute alarm. Option B, a CloudWatch dashboard. Option C, a high-resolution CloudWatch alarm with a 10-second or 30-second evaluation period and SNS action. Option D, a logs insights query. The correct answer is C, a high-resolution CloudWatch alarm with a 10-second or 30-second evaluation period and SNS action. Here is why. High-resolution metrics support alarm periods of 10 or 30 seconds, allowing the alarm to notify SNS within the requested window. Why are the other options not correct? A, standard resolution alarm periods cannot meet the 30-second requirement. B, a dashboard visualizes metrics but does not provide the required threshold notification. D, logs insights queries logs rather than evaluating the custom metric in near real time. Exam tip. Use high-resolution metrics and alarms for sub-minute CloudWatch alerting. Question number 391. A REST API is defined in CloudFormation and deployed through code pipeline. The template contains API gateway resources, methods, a deployment, and a stage. A new resource and methods are added, and the stack update finishes successfully, but the stage still returns. 404 for the new paths because no new API deployment snapshot was created. Which pipeline change makes the methods available? Option A. Disable rollback for the CloudFormation stack update. Option B. Add a code build action that runs AWS API create deployment for the REST API and target stage after the template update. Option C. Clear the stack failure options before the update. Option D. Run a CloudFront invalidation after the stack update. The correct answer is B. Add a code build action that runs AWS API create deployment for the REST API and target stage after the template update. Here is why. API gateway resource and method changes do not become callable until a new deployment snapshot is associated with the stage. Why are the other options not correct? A. Rollback behavior does not publish API changes. C. Stack failure options do not create an API deployment. D. CloudFront invalidation does not redeploy API gateway methods. Exam tip. Redeploy a REST API after changing resources, methods, integrations, authorizers, or policies. Question number 392. A registration service creates API gateway API keys by calling create API key. Existing clients can call the REST API, but every newly registered client receives 403 forbidden, even though the new key is valid. The API uses a usage plan to control access. Which additional API call should the registration service make? Option A. Call create deployment to redeploy the API for every key. Option B. Call create usage plan key to associate the key with the required usage plan. Option C. Call update authorizer to add the key to the authorizer. Option D. Call import API keys to import the key into the deployed stage. The correct answer is B. Call create usage plan key to associate the key with the required usage plan. Here is why. Creating an API key does not grant access by itself. The key must be linked to the usage plan that includes the deployed API stage. Why are the other options not correct? A. API keys do not require an API redeployment. C. Native API key validation is separate from Lambda or Cognito authorizers. D. Importing keys does not associate an individual key with the usage plan. Exam tip. API gateway API key access requires the key, a usage plan, and a usage plan key association. Question number 393. A Lambda function sends S3 files to an external SFTP server. The SFTP username and password are currently stored as Lambda environment variables. The developer wants encrypted, centralized storage for these credentials without treating KMS as a secret database. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Store the credentials as encrypted secure string parameters in Systems Manager parameter. Store and retrieve them at runtime. Option B. Store the credentials directly as values in AWS KMS. Option C. Put the credentials in an encrypted text file in S3. Option D. Replace the SFTP credentials with IAM database authentication. The correct answer is A. Store the credentials as encrypted secure string parameters in Systems Manager parameter store and retrieve them at runtime. Here is why. Secure string encrypts the SFTP credentials with KMS and lets the function retrieve them through IAM-controlled API calls. Why are the other options not correct? B. KMS manages encryption keys and ciphertext operations, not named application secrets. C. An encrypted file adds object retrieval and credential file management. D. IAM database authentication does not authenticate an external SFTP server. Exam tip. Use parameter store secure string or secrets manager for encrypted application credentials. Do not use KMS as a secret repository. Question number 394. A batch process on EC2 needs read-only access to a specific S3 bucket. The application must receive temporary credentials automatically and follow least privilege best practices. Which configuration should the developer use? Option A. Attach the S3 policy to an IAM user and place the user in an instance profile. Option B. Put the S3 permissions on an IAM role, add the role to an instance profile, and associate the profile with the EC2 instance. Option C. Assign an IAM group to the instance profile. Option D. Use Web Identity Federation for the EC2 process. The correct answer is B. Put the S3 permissions on an IAM role, add the role to an instance profile, and associate the profile with the EC2 instance. Here is why. The instance profile provides automatically rotated temporary role credentials, and the policy can be limited to the required S3 read actions and bucket. Why are the other options not correct? A. IAM users cannot be attached to instance profiles. C. IAM groups cannot be attached to EC2 instances. D. Web Identity Federation is unnecessary for an EC2 workload. Exam tip. Grant EC2 applications AWS access through a least privilege instance profile role. Question number 395. A Lambda-backed website repeatedly reads one daily article from an on-premises database and translates it into a small set of languages. Database load and response time are increasing, and the database cannot be modified. Which design provides reliable caching across Lambda execution environments? Option A. Invoke the request asynchronously even though the browser needs an immediate response. Option B. Store translated article results in a managed shared cache or durable key value store. Keyed by article version and language. Option C. Enable a non-existent translate text response cache. Option D. Use parallel processing for identical database reads. The correct answer is B. Store translated article results in a managed shared cache or durable key value store, keyed by article version and language. Here is why. A shared cache reduces repeated database reads and translation calls across all Lambda execution environments. Why are the other options not correct? A. Asynchronous invocation cannot return the browser response directly. C. Translate text has no automatic response cache. D. Parallel duplicate reads increase load. Exam tip. Use a shared cache when cached values must be available across Lambda execution environments. Question number 396. A Lambda function processes one partner order batch at a time. When a received batch contains 0 orders, the operations team must receive an SNS notification as quickly as possible with minimal new code. Which 2 steps meet the requirement? Choose 2. Option A. Publish a custom CloudWatch metric containing the order count for every processed batch. Option B. Send every order to Kinesis and create another Lambda consumer. Option C. Run a daily Lambda function that searches CloudWatch metrics. Option D. Create a CloudWatch alarm that publishes to the SNS topic when the custom metric equals 0. E. Log all orders to a Kinesis stream before processing. The correct answer is A. Publish a custom CloudWatch metric containing the order count for every processed batch. D. Create a CloudWatch alarm that publishes to the SNS topic when the custom metric equals 0. Here is why. The function publishes the exact business measurement for every batch, and the alarm evaluates 0 values and immediately invokes the existing SNS notification action. Why are the other options not correct? B. A second stream consumer adds unnecessary processing. C. A daily check is not immediate. E. Streaming every order does not directly detect an empty batch. Exam tip. Publish an explicit 0 custom metric when an alarm must distinguish 0 work from missing metric data. Question number 397. A deployment replaces static files in an S3 origin, but CloudFront continues returning the previous versions because they remain cached at edge locations. What should the deployment workflow do after uploading the new artifacts? Option A. Change the CloudFront origin to another S3 bucket. Option B. Delete every old object from S3 before uploading the release. Option C. Create a CloudFront invalidation for the affected object paths. Option D. Enable S3 object lock to force cache refresh. The correct answer is C. Create a CloudFront invalidation for the affected object paths. Here is why. An invalidation removes cached versions from edge locations so later requests retrieve the updated S3 objects. Why are the other options not correct? A. The origin is still correct. B. Removing source objects is unnecessary and can cause outages. D. Object lock controls retention and does not refresh CloudFront caches. Exam tip. Prefer versioned object names for routine releases. Use invalidations when cached paths must be refreshed immediately. Question number 398. A DynamoDB table uses order_ID as its partition key and item_count as its numeric sort key. A query currently returns matching items from the smallest item_count to the largest. The application needs the same query results in reverse order. Which request parameter should the developer use? Option A. Set key condition expression to false. Option B. Rename the sort key to item_count_descending. Option C. Set scan index forward to false in the query request. Option D. Add an LSI that contains the same sort key. The correct answer is C. Set scan index forward to false in the query request. Here is why. DynamoDB query returns sort key values in ascending order by default. Scan index forward equals false reverses the order without changing the key schema. Why are the other options not correct? A. Key condition expression defines key selection and is not a Boolean sort option. B. Renaming the sort key does not reverse result order. D. An additional index is unnecessary for the same key order. Exam tip. Use scan index forward equals false for descending DynamoDB query results. Question number 399. A Lambda function receives asynchronous invocations. Events that still fail after Lambda finishes its retry attempts must be retained for later inspection with the least custom development. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Start a step functions workflow for every failed event. Option B. Configure an asynchronous dead letter queue that uses an SQS standard queue. Option C. Send failed events to an SNS FIFO topic as the Lambda dead letter queue. Option D. Log all payloads and search CloudTrail for application exceptions. The correct answer is B. Configure an asynchronous dead letter queue that uses an SQS standard queue. Here is why. After asynchronous retries are exhausted, Lambda can place the failed event in an SQS standard queue for durable inspection and later replay. Why are the other options not correct? A. A workflow for every failure adds code and orchestration. C. Lambda asynchronous dead letter queues do not use SNS FIFO topics. D. CloudTrail does not store Lambda application payload failures. Exam tip. Use an SQS standard DLQ or an on-failure destination for exhausted asynchronous Lambda events. Question number 400. An application stores personal data in S3. Network requests must use encrypted transport. And the application must encrypt sensitive objects with a customer-managed KMS key that the company can rotate. Which two controls meet the requirement? Choose 2. Option A. Deny non-HTTPS S3 requests with a bucket policy condition on AWS Secure Transport. Option B. Use S3 block public access as the HTTPS enforcement mechanism. Option C. Encrypt the sensitive objects in the application with a customer-managed KMS key before upload. Option D, use a permissions boundary in the bucket policy to require HTTPS. E, configure a bucket policy that performs client-side encryption on behalf of clients. The correct answer is A, deny non-HTTPS S3 requests with a bucket policy condition on AWS, secure transport. C, encrypt the sensitive objects in the application with a customer-managed KMS key before upload. Here is why. The bucket policy enforces TLS for transport, while application-side envelope encryption with the customer-managed key protects personal data at rest under company key control. Why are the other options not correct? B, block public access does not enforce HTTPS. D, permissions boundaries apply to IAM principles, not as bucket policy transport controls. E, bucket policies authorize requests but do not perform client-side encryption. Exam tip. Enforce TLS with AWS, secure transport and use a customer-managed KMS key when the application needs control over data encryption. Question number 401. A DynamoDB table uses TTL to remove expired records. Before those records disappear completely, a serverless process must receive the deletion records, perform 5 minutes of processing, and archive the old item data in S3. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A, query expired items through DAX and copy them to S3. Option B, run a scheduled event bridge rule that scans the table for expired items. Option C, use DynamoDB streams to invoke Lambda for TTL deletion records, and have the function process and write the records to S3. Option D, operate a custom ECS on EC2 consumer. The correct answer is C, use DynamoDB streams to invoke Lambda for TTL deletion records, and have the function process and write the records to S3. Here is why. TTL service deletions appear in DynamoDB streams. Lambda can consume the old image, complete the 5-minute processing, and archive it to S3 without servers. Why are the other options not correct? A, DAX is a cache and does not emit TTL deletions. B, a scheduled scan is less direct and can miss asynchronous deletion timing. D, ECS on EC2 adds cluster and host operations. Exam tip. Combine DynamoDB TTL, streams, and Lambda when expired items must trigger serverless archival. Question number 402. A serverless application uses Route 53, API Gateway, and Lambda. During testing, the developer needs one managed place to search structured API and application logs without building a separate ingestion and analytics platform. Which solution requires the least operational work? Option A, enable API Gateway stage access logging in JSON, use the service's CloudWatch log groups, and query the logs with CloudWatch logs insights. Option B, send all service logs through Kinesis Data Firehose to S3 and operate OpenSearch. Option C, use CloudTrail for application runtime logs and query the trail with Athena. Option D, publish log text through putmetric data and query it with Athena. The correct answer is A, enable API Gateway stage access logging in JSON, use the service's CloudWatch log groups, and query the logs with CloudWatch logs insights. Here is why. CloudWatch log centrally stores the runtime logs, and logs insight searches multiple log groups without a separate delivery, indexing, or query platform. Why are the other options not correct? B, Firehose, S3, and OpenSearch add ingestion and operations. C, CloudTrail records control plane API activity, not all application runtime errors. D, putmetric data publishes numerical metrics, not log events. Exam tip. Use structured CloudWatch logs and logs insights for low-overhead serverless log analysis. Question number 403. An X-ray instrumented application has low-volume purchase and user interaction requests. That must always be traced. It also produces many health check and polling requests that provide little diagnostic value. Which sampling strategy best meets the requirement? Option A. Trace every important user or transaction request and apply a low sampling rate to the high-volume background requests. Option B. Trace every background request and sample important transactions at a low rate. Option C. Disable tracing for important transactions and sample background traffic at a high rate. Option D. Trace all request classes at the same universal rate. The correct answer is A. Trace every important user or transaction request and apply a low sampling rate to the high-volume background requests. Here is why. Custom X-ray sampling rules can match service and request properties, retain all important low-volume transactions, and reduce trace volume for routine background traffic. Why are the other options not correct? B. It prioritizes unimportant traffic and undersamples important requests. C. It discards the requests the company most needs. D. A universal rate caused the original visibility problem. Exam tip. Order specific X-ray sampling rules before broad defaults and sample high-value request classes more aggressively. Question number 404. An application is being moved from an on-premises MySQL database to RDS for MySQL. The application must authenticate without storing or retrieving a long-lived database password. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Store the database password as an environment variable. Option B. Store a password in parameter store as secure string. Option C. Enable IAM database authentication, grant the application role RDS-DB, connect, and use short-lived authentication tokens. Option D. Store the database password in Secrets Manager. The correct answer is C. Enable IAM database authentication, grant the application role RDS-DB, connect, and use short-lived authentication tokens. Here is why. IAM database authentication replaces a stored password with a temporary SIG-v4 generated authentication token and IAM authorization. Why are the other options not correct? A. Environment variables contain a long-lived password. B. Parameter store protects a password but the database credential remains long-lived. D. Secrets Manager secures and can rotate a password, but the application still uses a database password rather than temporary IAM authentication. Exam tip. Use RDS IAM database authentication when supported and the decisive requirement is short-lived database credentials. Question number 405. A WebSocket API uses a Lambda authorizer on the $connect route. The connection must be authorized from request credentials, and values returned by the authorizer must be available to the backend integration without clients resending secrets with every message. Which two configurations meet the requirement? Choose 2. Option A. Use a token Lambda authorizer. Option B. Use a request Lambda authorizer based on connection request parameters. Option C. Map values from the authorizer context into the integration request. Option D. Map an API key identity value that the authorizer did not return. E. Use a VPC endpoint policy as the WebSocket connection authorizer. The correct answer is B. Use a request Lambda authorizer based on connection request parameters. C. Map values from the authorizer context into the integration request. Here is why. WebSocket Lambda authorization is performed on $connect with request parameters. Values returned in the authorizer context remain available through $context.authorizer for backend request mapping during the connection. Why are the other options not correct? A. WebSocket APIs use request Lambda authorizers rather than REST token authorizers. D. An identity API key value is not a substitute for returned authorizer context. E. VPC endpoint policies do not implement application WebSocket authorization. Exam tip. Authorize a WebSocket connection on $connect and pass non-secret authorization context to later backend integrations. You have completed part 10 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.